first of all, you guys can leave. Come back on Thursday, okay? That's your warning. So, as I mentioned at the start of this semester, using your computers and your cell phones is not only not polite, it distracts the lecturer, it hinders your note-taking, and so I was going to take points off your course grade. I'm not going to do that because it's the first time as a warning, but please don't do that again, okay? The next person who is caught in that circumstance, being stupid, basically, is going to lose course points. Okay? If you don't want to come here, don't come here. Go ahead. No, just leave now. Come back on Thursday. If you don't want to come here, watch the video. You can do text messaging at home. All right, so another logistical announcement. Hossein had a very good idea, which is that we're going to do the submissions, the briefings on email, which means that before too long, as in later today, I will send you an email with the protocol for submitting the briefings. You'll send them to Hossein and I before the deadline. Then we will redistribute them back to you later the day on Thursday so that you can do the peer grading. It will be electronic. It will be anonymous, as we mentioned before, but it'll be easier in terms of paper handling. And your submissions of peer grading will also be sent in an email. So you'll get more details in an email later today. Thank God 21st century technology has reached our class. So the other one is that next week is the reading break, and I'll be giving you a couple things to read. As you know, your midterm is on the 25th. Does anybody have a midterm right after the break? A couple people? Okay, so it was for you guys that we pushed the midterm back. You're welcome. But we're gonna. So I got my Stillwater, Oklahoma shirt on here. Stillwater, Oklahoma has got nothing except this guy, who is what's his name? Something Pete. But this is my teaching shirt. It says you can read. No, you can if you read. Read and you can. Okay, so this is the theme called "You'll be reading over the vacation." That was my stupid joke. Sorry. But the back is much more interesting. So you'll be doing some reading on fisheries as well as Dolan. Sorry that if I haven't been giving you assignments on Dolan, you will end up reading the whole book. So if you feel like reading the whole book over holiday or whatever you're going to call this next week, go ahead and do that. That won't hurt you. Take reasonable notes, and you'll be fine for the midterm and the final exam. It will not be on the exam until I tell you it's on the exam. Okay, so don't worry preemptively. But if I assign it, then it's going to be on the exam. Second, homeworks will come back on Thursday. They're not here in my hands today. There was a lot more material for Hossein to work through. Okay. Before I get into the continuation of fisheries, I wanted to mention something which is going to show up later in this class and maybe all over the news in Canada. There was some research released yesterday from some University of Toronto branch campus scientists, which was really interesting. It was actually started with a student project. Now, I've told you that I count on you to bring some revelation in terms of student briefings or blog posts, better ways to do to understand the world, let's say, because people who give lectures year after year after year are not necessarily innovating, right? So some student at U of T asked a question, which is, well, what is the correlation between, or what is the matchup between environmental reports filed by the oil and gas industry in Alberta with respect to their emissions from the tar sands operations or the oil sands operations? What's the correlation between the numbers they state in the regulatory documents and the actual emissions according to academic estimates? And you would think this would actually be fairly close because we're talking physical science. You don't have to go off in the ocean and count salmon or anything like that. And it turns out that they had made a really big mistake, omission, obfuscation. My hidden chalk is still here. Okay, so the basic idea of the tar sands is you're going to have a mine. They're going to bring a whole bunch of rock basically out of the mine. They're going to melt it out or separate the oil from the sand, which is going to be in this operation. And in the process, they're going to release a lot of water. Or they're going to dirty a lot of water. That's called tailings. Tailings water is the water that comes out of the tail of the operation, and it is stored in ponds. And I've had a long-going discussion with someone over in Alberta, several people in Alberta, trying to figure out basically how much it costs to clean these ponds up. Okay? Because if any of you have paid attention, you know that these ponds are always photoed with dead birds in them, and they're not really good from an environmental perspective. And I'm always curious, well, why don't you clean them up? Okay. So the ponds have been sitting here, some of them for 30 or more years, holding water and a whole bunch of other substances that are not good for you, me, or fish, or birds, for that matter. And the industry has been saying, we produce this much pollution, X. We pollute from doing this, we pollute from doing this, and there's some pollution from here. But it turns out they forgot to include the pollution from evaporation, which turns out to be quite large, because we're talking about an enormous amount of surface area of water that is more or less full of petrochemicals. And if you've ever gone to a gas station and you smell the gasoline evaporating very quickly, some of these compounds are very volatile in terms of evaporating quickly. That's my non-scientific word for it. So, and when you think about things like greenhouse gases and all kinds of local pollutions and so on, you should be counting all those things. Well, the industry wasn't counting it, and so it turns out the pollution is more likely to be 3x from these, at least from the ponds, although I read one estimate that it's 2 orders of magnitude higher, which is 100 times higher. And this is going to be extremely interesting to see what happens with the policy discussion, as in, should those ponds be cleaned up, or should the evaporation be addressed in some way? So watch this story as it develops. We will come back to it when we cover mining, whether or not, and oil gas operations in the resource module. So that's, I think, I was just like, I fell off my chair yesterday when I saw this come up in the news. And you guys should not necessarily fall off your chair, but be aware of what's going on here. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're going to be doing modules. This is the fishery module. I realize there's a bit of a jump start. That was a brilliant introduction by John. You guys are very lucky because he's much better than me about those things. And what I'm going to try and do is talk about a little bit of the science of any particular topic. Then we're going to go into the resource economics of the topic, and then go to the environmental economics of the topic. Try and cover all 3 of those in our 3 our 3 time slots during each week. And right now we're doing fisheries, and after the reading break, I'll do forests. So let me get back into this information that John presented. One of the most interesting things that he saw was, he presented was the, I'm going to put effort over here, the yield curve, and this is maximum sustainable yield. And this is going to be both dollars and biomass, right? You've got numbers and dollars here. So he showed that with, let's see, the most effort, this was the fishery at its, which one was which? This is the, this is the most fish, and this is the least fish. And he reversed that because he wanted to show the relationship between effort and catch, and he drew a line like this, which was cost. And this is as a way of saying that as you put in more effort, you're putting in more cost. But I think we can modify this a little bit and say, well, let's just use an exponential curve, which is more appropriate for economics. An exponential cost curve, which means what? What does an exponential cost curve mean? Right, marginal cost is increasing, right? So as you put in, you put in a little bit of effort, it's not so hard. You put in more effort, you've got a 5-person crew on your boat that needs 5 people. You need to do more effort to get more fish out. You got 8 people on the boat. Now the boat's crowded and so on. So as you put in more and more effort, the cost climbs faster than the reward, so to speak. Okay? So you're getting decreasing returns, so to speak. So if we look at those two things, and the price of fish is exogenous, and the price of fish is fixed in the marketplace, and the price of fish is taken as given, right? You don't have market power. So this is not the entire fishery, but this is maybe one boat. Then what you want to do is you want to find the point where these two curves are parallel to each other, and this is going to end up being whatever. Right here, I'm using this curve here, so it's actually around, well, whatever. Somewhere in here is going to be max profit, right? Because you're putting in the lowest cost to get the highest yield. And I'm actually combining two things because I'm putting MSY, the yield curve for the entire fishery, and a cost curve for maybe one boat, but it actually probably should be all the boats. So the fishery should want to operate here. The important thing for you guys to know is two things. One is that this used to be the old goal. The old goal used to be catch the maximum number of fish possible. Maximum number of fish is not the same as maximum profit because there is a cost, right? So the old goal, and in some countries it is still the goal, is to get as much biomass as possible. But this is not necessarily, over here I show it being a loss, but if you use this curve here, you can get maximum yield, but at a high cost. Over here he's got a point where they cross, which could show break even if you're thinking about this in terms of the market price, but it's just a coincidence here. But basically what happens is as you go over this way, you're losing money from a profit perspective, okay? And even worse, you're wiping out the fishery. So if you go so far over, you get to some point, say, I don't know, just right here, and then you go to, you tip, it's called a tipping point, you tip the entire fishery into extinction. I went to the Galapagos Islands, which is in Ecuador, in December, and the Galapagos are famous for having an amazing amount of biodiversity. Honestly, if you have $1,000 to spend, which maybe you don't right now, but in your future, go there and see this sanctuary. It's unbelievable. Forget a zoo. This is unbelievable. If you want to see what basically a lot of the planet looked like before we started to eat everything. And it's just incredible. But one thing they had at this sanctuary for land tortoises was a hatching breeding area where they were breeding these tortoises. And the tortoises were nearly wiped out about 100 years ago because they were so handy for food. And all the people would just show up. These tortoises are this big around. It takes 100+ years for them to get this big. They just show up and they move like this. They're not real fast, right? So they're moving slowly. The sailors just come over, flip them on their back, and then they can take them on the boat with them and go sail away because they have food, right? Fresh meat on the boat. This was very popular. That actually wasn't the cause nearly of their extinction. Some of the species of tortoise on the Galapagos are extinct. There are no more, right? The cause of the extinction was people who showed up in the islands, the Galapagos, trying to make money, and they said, well, can we grow sugar? No. Can we make pineapples? No. Can we make tortoise oil? So they would kill the tortoise and render its body meat into oil, and then try and sell that like oil for a lamp, for lighting, right? And they had to kill tens of thousands of turtles to get, a ton of oil. And that's what was also happening with whales, remember. Whales were actually saved by the petroleum industry. That was amazing. Because when they discovered oil, the first product that came out of oil out of the ground was kerosene. And kerosene was used to replace whale oil for lighting. So the big destruction of whales for the oil in their bodies was altered when it came around to lighting. And so the same thing was happening with tortoises. And then finally, literally about 20 or 30 years ago, they realized that the best thing that you can make, best way to make money in the Galapagos is what? Tourism, not killing the tortoises, right? Letting people look at the tortoises. And it's crazy because suddenly now you've got a model of business in an island which has a very rich ecosystem but also fragile in a way. If you just kill all the tortoises, you just kind of screw up stuff. And they said, wow, we can just charge people to look at our stuff. And that is unusual, right? But that's actually how the Galapagos Islands economy works today. They have a big problem of all kinds of people coming over from the mainland to live, as well as the tourists. But at least they're not ruining themselves. So that's the story of the curves. And I'll make another note about whales and yield that is ridiculous that I read the other day, was that the fishery for whales, as I mentioned, was commercial for a long time. A lot of fishermen from Canada and from the U.S. made their living off of fisheries, made their fortunes off of fisheries around Boston and so on. And then the fisheries lost a lot of clients, a lot of business to oil. And there are still some fisheries that are in operation today. One of them is in Norway, where they hunt some whales that are not considered endangered anyway. The other one is in Japan, which is basically a government subsidy towards whale fishermen. Because Japanese people don't necessarily like whale, and the government pays a whole bunch, or the government subsidizes a whole bunch of whale fishermen, and they call it for scientific research, but the research they do is not scientific at all. And they kill the whales, and then they'll sell it in various markets. They sell it in the U.S. where it's illegal, and now you have police raids on restaurants for trying to sell whale and so on. But the Japanese government does this, I believe, as just a regular, everyday subsidy to fishermen. Right? It's not deep in the Japanese culture because the rise of whale meat eating in Japan happened actually after World War II when they were hungry. And the easiest thing to catch were whale, right? So it was kind of like, it was a food you would eat when you were starving. So a lot of Japanese don't really want to eat whale, but the government has not a nostalgia for eating whale, they have a nostalgia for giving money to fishermen. And they have the same nostalgia for giving money to farmers, by the way, rice farmers, which could end in the near future, but I'm not holding my breath. So worse, and by far worse, than the Japanese whale program was the Soviet whaling program, where you had basically a guy in Moscow who said, and this was how command and control economies work. I remember our best friend, Mr. Hayek, was talking about how it's hard to assemble information and get people to work together, and the price mechanism helps them do that. A command and control economy is kind of like blind and dumb. They're like wandering around trying to do something, and it's much easier to walk in a straight line. So what they did is they said, okay, in Wales, 1954, we got 40,000 whales, and because the Soviet Union is mighty, we're going to expand that by 20%. We set a target because they had a 5-year plan. So we need plus 20%. And so 1955, they're like, okay, we're going to have 50,000. And 1956, etc. What they were doing is they would send off ships full of Soviet fishermen to go hunt whales when there was no market for whales, just to meet the quota. They would kill the whale and bring it on board, or actually bring it on board, they would take a little, 10% of its meat or whatever, and throw the rest overboard. There was no economic value to the whales. There was only a planning value to capturing whales. And I just read this, and the Soviet Union was reporting internationally how many whales it was catching, but it was reporting only 10% of the whales it caught. So they were killing hundreds of thousands of whales every year just because it was part of the plan. Right? You have to be very concerned about this kind of problem because the economic waste was unbelievable. The sailors were subtracting value. The Soviet Union came up with this idea of value subtraction. How many of you have a job or have had a job for wages? Okay. Those of you who have not had a job, I will help you out. When you go to a job and they pay you money, say they pay you $10 an hour, they would prefer that you produce more than $10 an hour value. Okay? If they pay you $10 an hour and you burn down the restaurant, or you argue with the customers, or you break the $16,000 machine, they're not getting their money's worth out of you, right? You're going to get fired. So when you go to work, they pay you $10 an hour. They expect you to produce $11 an hour value, $200 an hour value. That's the whole idea. You are adding value to their enterprise. If you come and you subtract value to the enterprise, they should fire you. Basically, there's no point of you being there. Value subtraction occurs and occurred in many instances in the Soviet Union and other planned economies because they were not targeting value. They were targeting numbers. And the numbers were, we need to kill this many whales, or we need to have this many toothpicks. And so they would take a whole bunch of trees and make toothpicks regardless of the waste involved, right? And this doesn't happen necessarily in a market economy because there's no profits. This is one area where profits are actually a good idea because they help you measure your success. If you come out with a cell phone that costs $1,000 to make and no one wants to buy it and you sell it for $500, not only is it value subtracting, but you're going to be out of business unless you work for the government and you catch whales at a cost of $1,000 to produce $10 of value, right? The problem was not necessarily the $990 wasted, it was the dead whales in terms of ecosystems, in terms of the food web that he mentioned here. The food web is very important. So I just want to make that point about how not to manage a fishery. But I'll give you some more stories in a minute. Any questions, by the way? Oh, let me just totally put this on hold for a second. Any questions on the briefings? Is everything going okay on that? Have you done some research on that? And did you get all my emails saying, by the way, you're talking about pipelines in general, okay? So it's not a particular pipeline. Everything's cool? All's on plan? Okay, well, we'll find out when we see you guys, your submissions. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about some more economic stuff on fisheries as a resource. So before, we talked about the tragedy of the commons, right? And there were two simple ways to address the tragedy of the commons. What are two ways? Give me one way. I've got a common pool good. And it's being overexploited. What's one way to change that overexploitation? No. You in the red sweater. No, the red sweater, the one that you're wearing. Yeah. How do I get a common pool good that's being overexploited to stop being overexploited? Call it a fishery. Sorry? You're not sure. The girl next to you, are you sure? A license? How do you get a license? What does a license mean? Okay, she said a license. What does a license mean? What? Permission? Yes, that's the definition. But what does it mean when we have licenses? What kind of licenses are we talking about? What's the economic word for it that we've been talking about for the last couple weeks? We've got 4 types of goods. One of them is a common pool good. You've got 3 choices. Go ahead. You can guess. Ask her to pronounce it for you. Whisper in her ear. What? Exclusive? No, exhaustive. Oh, non-excludable, non-rival. Rival, is that what you're trying to say? Not the characteristic. What kind of good is it not? What do you not want to do from a common pool good? or kind of impossible to do, actually. Common pool good is what? It is non-excludable and rival. Okay, it's not going to turn into a public good kind of overnight, right? Because that'd be non-excludable, non-rival. We're talking about a fishery. So how can we reform fisheries? What's one way to do it? What? Property rights, yes. Privatize it. Well, actually, no. So you said property rights, which is correct. But there's two kinds of goods you can get out of a property rights change. One is what? What? Club good? Private good. Okay, so you can issue licenses, right? Right? And then you're going to have what kind of goods? Say it again. He said one and he said one. She said property rights. I'm just testing whether or not you're listening. Private good. And the other kind is the club good. Perfect. Okay, great. So we know why, we know what we're trying to get here. We're trying to get from a common pool good to either a private good or a club good via property rights. Okay, so if we're going to have in a fishery a club good, we could say, okay, look, everybody on the river is going to share the salmon that come on the river. You have to find your own internal rules to sharing the salmon, right? In lots of salmon streams, there would be these kind of traps with nets and so on. And we know this from history in North America that the First Nations or the Native Americans, depending on what country you're staying in because of the jargon, the First Nations people would put traps in the river. And the traps would catch the migrating salmon. But the traps belonged, it was a club good, the river was a whole club good. The salmon fish that came up, they all belonged to the tribe, so to speak. And they would put traps there that would belong to families over generations. It was a property right. And everybody knew that that net belonged to so-and-so, right? And if so-and-so's net washed away, say, yo, dude, your net washed away. Everybody knew whose it was, right? So that was a kind of a club good. The same thing happens with the lobster fishery in Maine in the United States. I know this is a fact because the lobster are not a migrating crustacean. They move a little bit, but they have a little bit of an area. They kind of hang out. And lobster get kind of big, and they're kind of valuable. And so the guys will drop down these cages. They're called, lobster pots. And they'll have a float on the surface. And it'll be, that's Bob's float, and that's Andy's float. And everybody will know whose floats are what, because they have their markings on it. And the club good means that you don't mess with someone else's float because that's their area, that's their place. Or however they do it every year. Maybe they say whoever can drink the most beer gets to put down their float first. It doesn't really matter. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to keep the yield, the fishing yield, profitable. They want to be over here. They don't want to be over here. So they need to make sure they have pots out to make money, but not so many that they overexploit the fishery. And if you come up as an outsider, which is unusual but possible in this fishery, and you bring your lobster pot with you, then you might drop it down. And the first time that happens, you might come back and look at your lobster pot, and there's a little interesting knot. Someone's tied it, like your shoelaces. This doesn't even have shoelaces. Like your shoelaces on your shoes. And someone will tie a knot on the top of your pot, which kind of signals something. It signals you shouldn't be here. The second time your pot is out there, it won't be there. They'll cut the rope, and your pot will be lost, right? Because the rule there is that you need to respect what everybody else is doing, right? The same thing happens with the abalone fishery in Australia, where, guess what? They issued property rights, they issued private property rights, which were individually transferable quotas. Transferable, individually transferable quotas An individually transferable quota is a private good. What it basically says is we're going to divide this fishery into this many units, and if you have a unit, if you have a license, you can catch a ton of fish, or you can get 100 kilos of abalone, or whatever it is. The whole idea of this is that the quota is set based on, over here, a total yield that they want to target. So they say, look, 10 years ago you were taking 200 units of fish, or abalone, or lobster, or whatever. Now we know there's really only space for 80 tons, let's say, or 8,000 tons, whatever it is. So you have to use less. We're going to put a limit, a cap, okay? And then if you have quota, so to speak, if you have a license, you're allowed to bring in that fish. You're allowed to bring in the lobster. You're allowed to bring in the abalone, and you can sell it legally. If you don't, you're breaking the law. Now, of course, this means you have to have a law system, which is also very important. It's the first thing you need in most countries. So they have a quota, and what happened when you have a quota is the fishermen who go out there to catch the abalone, they are going to... I hope I started that. Talk, yes, okay. Sorry. I don't want your classmates to miss the lectures. So they put out the quota there, and the quota initially you can give it away two ways. What's one way to give it away? A lottery. Okay, lottery. I'm going to do a lottery, and whoever wins the lottery gets to have quota. What's another way? There's three ways. You just come up with a third way. What? Auction. What's the most common way? The auction's the most efficient way. What's the most common way? Louder? First come, first serve. Yeah. Well, I'll go with that because it is actually in a way first come, first serve. It's called grandfathering. You get to have a license because your grandfather had a license. Okay? What it means is that if you're a fisherman and you were fishing already, you're going to get a license, right? And so if I caught 10 times as much fish last year or the last 5 years as you did, then I get 10 licenses and you get one. Okay? So one way or the other, they issue the licenses. That's all that matters. One way or the other. From the perspective of the government or the perspective of the marketplace, it doesn't matter how the licenses get issued because, number one, there's a cap. There's a limit on how many licenses are out there, which is a limit on how many fish will be caught. And number two, all those fish will end up on the market, so consumers don't even care who caught it. They just want to be able to eat the fish. But if you're a guy with a license and you're a guy without a license, it makes a huge difference because you don't have a license, you can't fish, and I can fish, right? So to the fishing community, it's very important who gets the licenses. But to the fishery or to the economy, it doesn't really matter. What happens is they put out a limited number of quota, and those are transferable. That means that they can sell it, right? Or they can trade it, or whatever that is. And so what happens is the first year they put it out, if they put it out by grandfathering, that means everybody gets their quota for free. Now, immediately there's a price to be had for that, right? Someone might say right away, you know what, this year I want to take it off, I'll sell my quota to you. How much do you want to pay me? And they pay whatever it is, $200 a ton or $20 a ton, I don't know. But over time, what happens is the quota itself, the property itself, the license becomes worth more money based on this phenomena. If you're dialing back the fishery over here, if you were fishing over here before they instigated the quota, and you were losing money, basically, because the fishery was overexploited, and as you come back on the amount of catch, and the amount of effort per unit of catch goes down, as you make more money per ton of fish, the quota becomes more valuable because you have access to that fishery. If you're fishing in this kind of fishery here, where you're maximizing profits, that is the most valuable quota you can have. What does this mean? Is that the fishermen who own this stuff become very rich, which of course is what's supposed to happen, right? They were poor because they were overfishing before. They were running out their fish, they were working too hard, and they were getting poorer and poorer and poorer. The quota actually limits their exploitation, their overexploitation of the commons. It ends the tragedy of the commons, and it ends up putting them back into an economically and environmentally, if you want, sustainable path. What happens then is when your quota is worth a lot of money, you don't like people to come along and take fish without quota, right? You will now, if you are all fishermen, so to speak, and someone comes in and says, hey, I'm just going to fish here, you guys hang out, have a good time, you're going to stop that person from taking basically fish that belong to you. This is your property, right? And what was told to me by a guy who worked down in the abalone fishery in Australia is that guys who fished without quota, their trucks were thrown off of cliffs, sometimes with them in it, right? Because the fishermen did not appreciate so-and-so showing up and taking their fish. I saw this, the abalone, I saw this when I was in Honduras. The local fishermen were catching lobster off their island, and some guy came from the mainland. Honduras is a very poor country. He came from the mainland. These guys came from the mainland to take lobster on their own, to steal the lobster, basically, because it was their fishing area, belonged to the islanders. And these guys called the police. Police don't give a shit. They don't care. And they actually arrested the outsiders on their own and turned them over to the police, who finally showed up, right? But they were enforcing their property rights. Club goods, right? It was a club good in that country, but it could have easily been a private good. The fact is, it doesn't really matter which one it is. It should match the local situation, okay? All that matters is that you put a limit on the total catch to reduce the problem of overexploitation of common pool. And then you get back to profitability, you get back to sustainability. Okay. Let me go further into the economics of this, because on Thursday I'll talk more about the interaction of the environmental and the resource dimensions of fisheries, okay? But this property rights regime is new in many places, okay? So we've gone through, in fisheries, we've gone through kind of 3 stages, let's say, of a common pool fishery. If you have a fish, so, yeah, we'll keep it that for a second. So what you have is open access, which means that it starts off as a public good, non-excludable, non-rival. There's just so many fish, there's not enough people to catch all of them. There used to be stories, people would walk across the river on top of the backs of the fish, right? There were so many salmon. Open access, public good. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is now it's become a common pool good. So we have overexploitation. It's overexploited. And in that circumstance, you could have a crash. The fishery will be wiped out. Or you can have an intervention, which is going to be like a regulation. And the regulation was the most common stage after open access became a problem. The government would step in and say, hey, you guys, we're fishing too much. Sometimes the community would stop on its own, and it would go from overexploited, and it would come up with a club good solution, right? That's also possible, and it has certainly happened in lots of areas of the world, because the local people would figure out how to manage their own fishery. But when it comes down to commercial fisheries, where the community was not so tight in terms of its social relations, then it was not unusual for, or for the whales fisheries or something, an open access like at open seas fisheries in international waters, then they would not have the social cohesion, they would not have the social bonding to work together to stop it. So they would go into this overexploitation. It would either crash or it would be regulated in some way, and regulation is going to include later on property rights. But the earliest forms of regulations would actually take the form of like a fishing season, for example. So what would happen is the government would say, okay, you used to be able to fish whenever you want for lobster, halibut, for example, A halibut is a huge fish. It's about this big around. It's quite flat. It's a bottom-feeding fish. But they can weigh 100, 200 kilos. They're very big fish. And the halibut fishery up near Alaska, I can't even draw Alaska. This is a bad version of Alaska. Here's the islands, la la la. Okay, so here's Alaska, and here's Canada. This is Yukon. And then la 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 la, and here we are down here. Okay, so Alaska was over here. They had the halibut fishery there. It was open access. There's plenty of fish. We're having overexploitation. The U.S. government steps in and says, you know what? We're going to make the season shorter. You're fishing too many days. We want to make it shorter. So instead of making 12 months, we're going to make it 3 months. Oh, and by the way, you're using too much gear to catch the fish. We want to make you use a different gear to slow down how much fish you catch. So you can't use a net that scrapes the bottom of the ground, a trawling net. You have to use like a fishing line with a hook on it or something like that. And your boat is too big, so we're going to put a limit on how long your boat is. So you can't make a longer boat because we don't want you to have a big boat with lots of nets that are going out of the season. So they change the season, they change the gear, they change the equipment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So they have limits on the size, right? So they say you can only catch smaller halibut, juvenile halibut. You can only catch it like whatever, half a meter or 1 meter long. If you catch a 2 meter halibut, put it back in, because those are sexually reproductive, sexually procreative. What does that mean? They are reproducing. So at a high rate, and you want to have the mama fish out there making all kinds of babies, right? So because halibut might take 10 years to get maturity or 30 years to get to maturity. So the regulations came in and said, okay, we're going to change the season, we're going to change the nets, we're going to make sure your boat's not any longer than this. But anybody can come and fish if they want to. And as long as it's profitable, given that we still have a commons in terms of the property rights, people will keep coming in. And what happened is they said, oh, now there's too many boats. I need a bigger boat that can carry more gear. In fact, I want a really big boat that'll carry a lot of gear. It's not longer than the limit, but it is bigger. And now I can carry more, I can put more people on there, and we can use these inefficient hooks or whatever. And the halibut season, the reason I'm telling you this long story, the halibut season got down to 6 hours long per year. 6 hours per year is how long that season got. Because there are so many boats with so much gear chasing so few fish that they just said, we have to make it shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter until it's 6 hours long. Now, with 6 hours long, what you're getting is crazy amounts of effort, right? You've got to have a very fast motor. You're going to overhaul the motor the day before the season, right? Because if your motor dies, you're out of business. You're going to get a very fast motor. You're going to be like, you're going to go out at 100% power because you've got to beat everybody else out there. You're trying to catch fish as fast as possible, so you only have 6 hours. So you have fingers getting lost. You got guys going overboard. You're bringing in the fish in terrible condition because you don't care. You just got to get the fish out of the net, into the hold, and back in the water with the net. And then guess what? 50 boats show up with fish, fresh fish, of the entire year to shore. And who wants to have halibut right now? The whole world needs halibut to have this many fish. So they want to freeze the fish. So now you've got all these guys come on shore, and you've got 3 frozen fish operations. And these guys have lunch the day before the season. They say, so, Bob, what you going to pay per pound, per fish, per ton? I think we might want to have a lower price this year. What do you think about that? They would make an oligopolistic deal, right? They would fix the price of fish that they would pay the fishermen. Would they fix it high or low? What would you say? Low, right, because they would make a bigger profit. And these boats show up. They've just killed themselves for 6 hours or whatever. They didn't sleep at all. And they're going to take the price. And they go to one place or another. These guys all have the same price. So these guys, the fishermen, don't even make any money. Right? All the profit, all the surplus, so to speak, goes to the freezer guys. And then people around the world eat frozen halibut for a year, Alaska frozen halibut. So this was actually not working very well, right? The fishery was on very high effort, right? And the fish were in terrible condition. And what they did is they put an ITQ system in place in Alaska. Okay, so if I put an ITQ system in place, what if you're all the fishermen now and you're sitting there going, okay, I've got quota. There's 40 tons of fish out there. Each of you owns a ton. What would you do differently than with your quota? You could sell the quota to make more money. What's another change in behavior you would make now that you have quota compared to the old regulation system? What would you do differently? Are you going to fish all of your season in 6 hours? You can do all your fishing in 6 hours? What would you do? You do it a little bit here and there. Maybe on a sunny day. Right? You change when you go. What else would you do? You're a fisherman. Think like a fisherman. Think about it this way. What were you doing before? What's the opposite of that?
Well, you wouldn't have to freeze everything and take the price from the
Fresh fish. Okay, so we can sell. We know that all the time. We'll leave that aside. You change timing. Fresh fish. What else? In the back, right there, you. You don't know. You're a fisherman. Pretend. Video game. What would you do? It's the opposite of what I just said. What did I just say? Hold on. Who's taking notes? You're taking notes. What did I just say would happen with the fishery? What was happening in the fishery in Alaska before with the 6-hour season? What was going on? What? Okay. And the opposite of that is to do different timing. What's another thing they were doing? I erased the big hint there. Yeah, what's... Right, so now you've got a change in market power. What else? Change of the size of the boats and gearing and so on. You don't have to have a super-powered turbo boat. You just go out in your little dinghy, right? So you change your gear, you change your crew, etc. What happened is, basically, they put in less effort and made more money, and the fishery was recovering, right? You can't get better than that. That was the whole idea. So that was because ITQs gave them the freedom to fish when they felt like it. All right, I'll quickly give an example of a similar situation that was just dumb as fuck, basically. It was a salmon fishery in northern Alaska. Same situation. Salmon, too many boats, a lot of effort. They did quota. They put quotas in place. Still a lot of effort. And half of the group, you guys are divided here. This half of the group formed a co-op. And they pooled all their licenses into one. So they had like 25 licenses, 25 tons of salmon. These guys are all you go on your individual boats and you catch salmon. These guys said, look, let's get all our licenses together. Only 5 of us will go out fish. We'll choose it randomly, and we'll all share the profits. So what ended up happening is, it was communism. What they did is they all went out, or these guys, a portion went out. They took their time. They had plenty of, each boat could bring in a huge capacity to fish because they had so much quota. They put in very little effort because they took the best boats. All the guys were well rested, volunteered, whatever the hell it is. They did it. Somehow they figured it out. These guys all started making killer profits. They were catching more fish with less effort. These guys were still like oh my God, I got to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't want to work today, but I have to because it's my quota. So these guys are making the same profit, but they were all being driven crazy by this competition. These guys have figured out to relax, right? So this is America, where this happened, in Alaska. And in America, we're really well known for cowboys. And the cowboys over here did not like the communists over here. So they actually sued in court, and they won a judgment against the co-op, because in Alaska the law says if you're a fisherman, you have to be on a boat. You can't be a fisherman on shore. So that meant that everybody here who was sitting back, rotating out on the fisheries, and I'll rest, and I'll do the boat, and I'll do the fish, and I'll do the marketing, not allowed. You're supposed to go out there and try and kill yourself. That's how you're a fisherman. Don't get smart. So what the court did is they said, we really, really hate this because it's stupid as fuck, but we're going to dissolve the co-op and make you go out and do your fishing. This group won. So they actually had the smart people get stupid again like them, right? But these guys were forced to go back to that. That's the way the law was written. Sometimes the laws are not so smart. All right.